Brian's life seemed perfect, until a devastating discovery turned his world upside down. What happens when betrayal comes from the one you least expect, and the fight for truth and redemption begins? Earlier that day, Brian Welker had been beaming with pride. He'd just received the news that he'd been promoted to shift supervisor at Harding Containers, a role that took effect immediately. The position came with a catch: he'd be working the night shift for the foreseeable future. But for Brian, this was far from a drawback, it was a win. Unlike most people, Brian actually preferred the night shift. His son, Tim, was a junior in high school and heavily involved in sports and extracurricular activities. By working nights, Brian could attend his son's games and events without worrying about missing work. Over the years, he'd worked the night shift several times and had perfected a system of naps and routines that kept him balanced and productive. It was this very system that led him to his current project, crawling through the rafters of his attic on a sweltering August afternoon. After hearing about his promotion, he'd been given Thursday and Friday off with pay, a chance to rest and get ready for his new schedule, which would start Sunday evening. Brian saw it as the perfect opportunity to work on a long-held dream, converting the space above his detached garage into a small apartment. This apartment would be his fortress of solitude, a quiet retreat where he could sleep during the day without the usual disturbances of a busy household. To make the apartment livable, he needed reliable internet access. The Wi-Fi signal from the main house barely reached the garage, so Brian decided to run a cable through the attic to install an extender. The plan was simple: place the extender on the side of the house closest to the garage, boosting the signal so it would cover his new apartment. As he painstakingly unwound the cable along the length of the attic, Brian was absorbed in the task. The still air was stifling, and beads of sweat dripped from his forehead. Suddenly, faint sounds drifted up from the house below. That was odd. It was early afternoon, and the house should have been empty. His wife, Brenda, was at work, and Tim had gone to visit her parents for a few days. Curious, Brian paused and strained to listen, unsure of what he was hearing. The house should have been empty. The faint sounds Brian heard sparked a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Crawling carefully through the attic's wooden beams, he followed the noise, moving closer until he pinpointed the source. It was coming from his bedroom. The realization sent a jolt through him, and he instinctively froze, his heart pounding. He inched closer, stopping above the old, unused air conditioning vent in the bedroom ceiling. Years ago, Brenda had complained that the vent blew cold air directly on her at night, causing neck pain. In response, Brian had installed a new one further from her side of the bed. He never sealed the old vent, though, leaving it loosely attached to the ceiling without connecting it to any ductwork. That oversight now gave him a vantage point he hadn't expected, or wanted. Gingerly lifting the fiberglass insulation covering the vent, Brian peered through the slats. The sight before him drained the strength from his body. His wife, Brenda, was in their bed with another man, a slim, unfamiliar figure. Pain gripped Brian as he stared, unable to tear his eyes away. The scene unfolding beneath him wasn't just a betrayal, it was the crumbling of everything he thought he knew about his marriage. The couple was fully engaged, oblivious to the silent witness above them. Brian's thoughts began to race as shock gave way to anger and determination. He reached for his phone, shakily setting it to record video. Carefully, he positioned it against the vent, ensuring the camera captured the entire scene. His hand trembled as he pressed record, but his resolve was steady. If nothing else, he needed proof of what was happening. "I love the way you are," the man murmured, his voice smooth and smug. "Your husband never touches you like this." "Don't mention Brian," Brenda replied, her protest weak and unconvincing in Brian's ears. "It's not about him. He's a good lover, and a great father." The man laughed softly. "Yet here we are, in his bed. You insist you like the way he does things, but look at this. What's wrong with this picture?" Brenda hesitated. "I don't know why I let you talk me into doing this here," she admitted. "Because you know there's no chance of being caught, the man replied with a smirk. And because it excites you. Brenda gave a small, humorless laugh. That sounds terrible. You like it, he pressed, his voice dripping with arrogance. You're a sexy woman, and the love is great. But knowing you're married and we're doing this in his bed. That's what makes it amazing. It's a competition, at least for men. And right now, I'm winning. Brenda didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes to Brian. His stomach churned as the man added, it wouldn't feel so great if Brian caught us, though. Each word was like a blade, cutting deeper into Brian's heart. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay quiet as the magnitude of the betrayal weighed down on him. His marriage, his life, was unraveling before his eyes, and all he could do was watch. With only 2 years left before Tim finished high school, Brian made a decision: his son would be his main priority from now on. Brenda no longer occupied his thoughts in the same way, and he found himself indifferent to her needs and feelings. Why should he care about someone who had shown him such contempt? Her actions had erased any obligation he felt toward her. Leaving the house he'd poured 15 years of work into was out of the question. He'd spent countless hours renovating and improving it, and the idea of abandoning it so someone else, especially the man he'd seen with Brenda, could enjoy it was unbearable. Brenda didn't seem inclined to file for divorce, so Brian resolved to stay, at least until Tim graduated. He would endure, focusing on his role as a father and on his own sense of stability. That evening, as Brenda arrived home, Brian studied her with fresh eyes. For the first time in years, he noticed things about her he'd somehow missed before. There were faint lines on her face that hadn't been there when they first met, and she'd gained a bit of weight. These details seemed insignificant, but they struck Brian now with an odd clarity. Had his love for her blinded him? Had it made him overlook her flaws, real or imagined? The realization left him feeling unexpectedly detached and sad, not for Brenda, but for what their marriage had once been. Whatever his feelings, he reminded himself, this change wasn't his doing. Brenda had chosen to betray him, and he was merely responding to her decision. You're home early, Brenda said, her tone neutral as she stepped through the door. Yeah, Brian replied nonchalantly. There was an issue at work, so they let us out a bit early. He watched her carefully, noting the faint unease in her expression. To him, she seemed different, almost unfamiliar. He realized he no longer saw her the way he once had. Her betrayal had shattered that lens forever. That night, as Brian prepared for bed, he headed toward the guest room instead of their shared bedroom. Brenda noticed and followed him, puzzled. Why are you sleeping in the guest room? She asked. We're barely going to see each other once your night shift starts. Why don't you sleep in our bed tonight? Brian had anticipated this question and delivered his rehearsed excuse smoothly. Since I worked last night and slept a few hours this morning while you were at work, I'm not really tired yet, he said. I'm going to watch a baseball game and maybe a movie after that. I'm just trying to adjust to staying awake at night for my new schedule. Brenda seemed to accept his explanation, though her furrowed brow suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. She didn't press the issue, though, and Brian silently congratulated himself on his quick thinking. The next night, Brian reported for his first shift as a supervisor. By the time the production team started arriving, he felt confident and energized about his work. For the first time in weeks, he had something positive to focus on, a new role that required his attention and expertise. He hadn't mentioned the promotion to Brenda. Why should he? She clearly had her own secrets, and he had no intention of sharing his good news with someone who had betrayed him so deeply. Brian no longer felt any hesitation about keeping things to himself. As far as he was concerned, Brenda had forfeited the right to transparency in their relationship. His first shift as a supervisor went exceptionally well, with his team welcoming him warmly. He quickly decided he had a great group of people working under him, which made the increased responsibilities of his new position much easier to bear. By the time his shift ended, Brian was already envisioning his future in the new bachelor pad he was creating above the detached garage. Over the weekend, he had gone out and picked up everything he needed to make the space livable: a large flat-screen TV, a refrigerator, an oven, and a microwave. By Monday afternoon, he expected the place to be fully operational, allowing him to focus on work and his own peace of mind. He couldn't help but chuckle as he recalled Brenda's reaction when she came home earlier that day to find a crew working on the garage. Brenda had been visibly unsettled, watching the workers scurry around the garage like ants. She approached Brian as he spoke with the foreman and demanded a private conversation. "Brian, what's going on? Why didn't you tell me about this?" she asked, her tone a mix of confusion and irritation. Brian turned to her with a calm smile. "I hired them to complete the renovations," he said casually. "It's something I've wanted to do for a while." Brenda frowned, her confusion deepening. "You could have at least discussed it with me. This is our home, Brian. Don't you think I deserve an explanation?" He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I don't owe you any explanations, Brenda," he said. Then, with a broad grin, he walked away, leaving her standing there, completely baffled. Later that evening, Brenda found herself preoccupied with Brian's attitude. Something about him had changed, and it unnerved her. For years, he had been an attentive and caring husband. Now, he seemed distant, almost indifferent. She couldn't deny that it bothered her. It was easy enough to stop Grant from making demands about using their marital bed for his fantasies, but dealing with Brian's sudden emotional detachment was proving far more challenging. Determined to win him back, Brenda resolved to plan an unforgettable evening. She envisioned a romantic dinner, something to remind Brian of the connection they once shared. However, as she made her plans, Brian remained focused on other things. During dinner one evening, they had an odd exchange about one of Tim's friends. "Do you know what your son told me today?" Brenda began. "His new friend's real name is Horace." Brian laughed, shaking his head. "Horace? No wonder he has a nickname. What kind of parents name their kid Horace unless they're trying to make him miserable?" Brenda ignored his comment and continued. "Tim also said Horace's father died of a brain aneurysm 2 years ago. His mom moved here over the summer to be closer to her aging parents. She's taking care of them now." Brian raised an eyebrow. "I'll just call the kid Scooter and pretend I never heard his real name," he quipped. Then, with a grin, he added, "You know, letting your son spend time with a guy named Horace seems risky. Looking at women is the best part of being a man." Brenda sighed, sensing that Brian was only half listening, but she let it go. The conversation felt off, like so many others had recently. For now, she decided to focus on her plans for a memorable evening, hoping it might bring back the Brian she once knew. Brian grinned at Brenda's objection and quipped, "He needs to learn to appreciate the fairer love, and I'll show him what to notice and how to go about it. Don't worry, I'll make sure you're less noticeable during these lessons." Still smiling, Brenda shot back, "The first thing you might want to teach him is to stand up to anyone who calls him Horace, except his mom, of course." "Fair enough," Brian joked. "But just to be clear, I was kidding about the life lessons." Brenda laughed lightly. "Good, because you'll always be a mentor to me," she teased, as Brian turned and headed back to the truck. The day turned out to be a great one. Brian had spent hours playing with Tim and Scooter at the park, throwing baseballs and goofing around. Scooter managed to catch a wild pop fly, and the boys celebrated by eating way too many hot dogs and guzzling down sodas. By the time they were headed home, both boys had passed out in the back of the truck before Brian even pulled out of the parking lot. When they arrived at Scooter's house, Brian carefully woke the sleepy teen and helped him to the front door. Scooter's mom greeted them warmly, thanking Brian for looking after her son and for taking the time to help build his confidence on the baseball field. Scooter had shown some promise earlier in the season but lacked the confidence to shine. Brian decided to help him however he could, spending extra hours on weekends practicing at the local park. For Brian, it was a way to channel his energy and relieve the tension he felt in other parts of his life. He threw himself into helping Scooter develop his skills, watching with pride as the boy's confidence and level of play steadily improved. By mid-season, Scooter was not only hitting well but also playing shortstop like a seasoned athlete. Tim, meanwhile, excelled as the team's starting center fielder, batting third in the lineup. The boys' progress on the field brought Brian a sense of fulfillment that extended beyond the game itself. At one game, Brian and Brenda sat together in the stands as Scooter stepped up to the plate. Brenda leaned over, her tone playful. "I hope you're paying attention. You know the friendliest moms on the team are also the single ones. You're a great dad, a nice guy, and you have a decent job. That makes you a pretty attractive candidate in their eyes." Brian chuckled and shook his head. "I'm not worried about that," he said. "Right now, I'm just focused on the boys, and making sure Horace learns to hold his own out here." With that, he turned his attention back to the game, watching as Scooter hit a line drive into left field. For a moment, Brian forgot about the complications in his personal life and simply enjoyed the sight of the boys thriving. The image of Grant and Brenda in their bed was etched into Brian's mind, a searing moment that had shifted him from suspicion to certainty in mere seconds. His wife's betrayal was no longer a question but an undeniable reality, and with it came a wave of conflicting emotions. Somehow, Brian had managed to stay composed, even when his closest confidant, a concerned friend, pressed him about it later. "You actually saw them?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. "I mean, in your bed? And you stayed married? How did you not lose it? Are you some kind of voyeur or something?" She quickly waved her hand, backtracking. "Sorry, forget I said that. But seriously, how did you keep your cool?" Brian shook his head, forcing a tired smile. "No, I'm not a pervert, and I'm definitely not okay with it. But I decided there were bigger things at stake, mainly Tim. I'm not about to give Brenda or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing me lose control." His friend gave a half-smile but couldn't hide her discomfort. "You're a better man than I am, that's for sure. If I were younger, less homely, and not so flat-chested, I'd have thrown my hat in the ring by now," she said with an awkward laugh. Realizing her words, she quickly added, "I think I should shut up now." Brian chuckled softly, though his frown lingered. "Thanks for at least being honest enough to tell me what people are saying. I had no idea the whole world already saw me as, well, a cuckold. It's embarrassing, but it is what it is." "Hey," she said, her voice softening. "You're not weak. You're just a good man trying to do right by his son. That takes strength, Brian, more than most people would have." Brian nodded but didn't reply. He appreciated the sentiment, though it didn't make the situation any easier. At the next game, Brian's attention was torn between Tim's performance on the field and the growing attention he was receiving from some of the other team moms. Brenda's betrayal had left a void in his heart, and it seemed like every single mother in the bleachers had noticed it. They weren't shy about making their interest known either. Brandy Dorn, for instance, was always nearby, constantly finding excuses to lean toward Brian, either to pick up something or to ask him about the team. Brian couldn't help but notice her striking figure, particularly her tight sweaters that emphasized her hourglass frame. Her questions about the players seemed more like pretexts for lingering conversations. Jillian Patterson, on the other hand, was far less subtle. She had a habit of standing so close to Brian that her shoulder or arm would brush against his. On one occasion, she leaned in close enough for him to feel the warmth of her body as she whispered a comment about the game. It was clear she wanted his attention, though Brian wasn't sure what to make of it. As much as Brian noticed their advances, he remained focused on the reason he was there, Tim. His son's games mattered more than anything else. When Brenda asked why he insisted on attending every game despite their strained relationship, his answer was simple: this game is important to Tim, and that makes it important to me. He wasn't about to let anyone, Brenda, the team moms, or even his own doubts, distract him from being the father his son needed. Whatever turmoil brewed in his personal life, it would stay off the field. I haven't seen much of you since you started working the night shift, Brenda said, her voice tinged with a mix of sweetness and regret. So, I thought it would be nice to spend some time together cheering on Tim. Brian nodded silently, his eyes fixed on the field as they settled into the bleachers. Brenda couldn't help but notice the other mothers casting curious glances her way. Their expressions weren't particularly welcoming, and she wondered if she was being silently judged. The crack of Scooter's bat meeting the baseball shattered her thoughts. Gasps and cheers rippled through the crowd as the ball soared over the center field fence. Tim sprinted across home plate, pausing just long enough to wait for Scooter to join him. The two boys exchanged an enthusiastic high five as the stands erupted in applause. Brenda glanced at Brian and was taken aback to see small tears glistening in his eyes. She knew how much effort he had poured into coaching Tim and Scooter, spending endless hours practicing at the park and refining their skills. The pride and joy radiating from him were palpable, and for a moment, it softened her view of him. But as her gaze lingered on Brian, memories of her affair with Bill bubbled to the surface. She recalled Bill's words with a mix of unease and guilt, "Give me the day when I can master you in your bed. That still turns me on." The memory sent a chill through her. At the time, she had justified her actions by telling herself that Brian was too consumed with work and Tim's baseball to notice her or meet her needs. She'd reasoned that she deserved some fun after all the effort she put into running their home, working full-time, and keeping up appearances. Brenda couldn't deny that Bill's casual dismissal of their relationship as temporary fun had stung. "We know this won't last long," he had said, smiling as if their affair were nothing more than a fleeting indulgence. Now, as she watched Brian proudly cheering for Tim, the weight of her choices pressed down on her. Later, Brenda confided in her friend Gertrude, clearly frazzled. "You know, I've noticed some of the single mothers on the team have been paying Brian extra attention," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I'm worried that one of them might try to seduce him." Gertrude raised an eyebrow, her disbelief evident. "Let me make sure I understand this," she replied, incredulous. "You're concerned that these attractive, single moms might take an interest in Brian, so you're asking me to pretend to fill in for you? To play the supportive wife?" Brenda hesitated, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I just think it might help if Brian feels like someone is there for him. Maybe it'll remind him of us." Gertrude folded her arms and gave Brenda a pointed look. "You could have saved your marriage if you'd done that yourself in the first place," she said. The words hung heavy in the air, leaving Brenda to wrestle with the reality of her own choices. As Brian watched Tim's game, Brenda's words replayed in his mind from earlier in the week. She'd made an offhand comment about being a successful single mother, her tone laced with bitterness. "Do you think that's because I don't have big boobs or the perfect figure? I'd probably feel a lot safer if I stayed close to you at these practices and games." Brian had laughed it off at the time, but Gertrude, seated next to him, had turned the remark into a playful jab. "You know, you'll never really be safe around any single woman," she teased. "Doesn't matter how homely she looks or how small her breasts are." Brian smirked. "Gertrude, or should I call you Minx? You're one of the most attractive women I've ever met. And it's not just about looks, it's the whole package. You're genuine, kind, and real. None of that silicone and bleach nonsense." The unexpected compliment made Gertrude blush. "Wow, Brian, thanks," she said, her voice tinged with embarrassment. "That's really sweet, but you just made my job a whole lot harder." Brian raised an eyebrow, genuinely confused. "What job?" "Keeping my distance," she admitted, a sheepish grin spreading across her face. "You've been through so much, and you're still so thoughtful. It's hard not to notice." Later that week, Brian found himself accompanying Tim's team on a trip for an away game. He'd assured Tim beforehand that he wouldn't interfere and that his behavior would stay above board while the team was under the watchful eyes of their coaches and chaperones. Brian just wanted to be there to support his son during practice the following morning. As the Winstons arrived at the team hotel, Brian was surprised to see Gertrude, or rather, Minx, wheeling her bags into the same lobby. "What hotel are you staying at, Minx?" Brian asked, raising an eyebrow. Her answer was simple. "The same one as you." Brian blinked, puzzled. "I never told you where I was staying." "How did you know?" "I didn't," she said with a shrug, her response curt but casual. The coincidence felt strange, but Brian decided not to overthink it. That evening, Gertrude's demeanor shifted. As they talked in the hotel's lounge, she became unusually direct. "Brian," she said, her voice low, "can you honestly give me one reason why we shouldn't sleep together?" Brian blinked in shock, caught entirely off guard. "What? Is it because of my appearance?" "Because if it is, I'll have you know your wife thought I was the perfect front, someone who wouldn't threaten her marriage because she believed I'd never be sexually attracted to you." She paused, her tone softening. "But I am attracted to you. And I need to know, am I just unwanted?" Brian shook his head firmly. "Minx, you're extremely desirable, never doubt that. But I've never cheated on Brenda, and that's not something I take lightly." Her lips curved into a playful smile. "You've got more than 6 months before the next school year begins. A lot can happen in that time, Brian. Unless you think you're too old for a steady diet of, well, attention from a very needy woman." Brian chuckled, trying to diffuse the tension. "Minx, you're making it hard for me to live up to my nickname." Her laughter echoed softly, but behind it was an unspoken question hanging in the air, one that Brian wasn't ready, or willing, to answer. Minx promised with a playful grin, "I'll do this for you. When you need me, just whistle." Brian chuckled at her boldness. "Then I guess I'd better learn to whistle. I've always been told my technique is respectable." "That's your first mistake," Minx teased. "You're doing it all wrong." Later that evening, back at home, Brenda's frustration boiled over as she snapped at Brian. "What's wrong with you? With that attitude, you might just forget I even thought about letting you touch me again." Brian, already turned away from her, barely reacted. "Okay," he replied coolly, rolling onto his side so his back was facing her. His response was curt, even out of character, but it had the desired effect, avoiding intimacy with Brenda. Despite achieving his goal, a wave of regret washed over Brian. He couldn't deny that the state of their marriage weighed heavily on him. This wasn't how things were supposed to turn out. But he quickly pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on what mattered most, Tim and his responsibilities. The next day, Brian's phone buzzed during his shift. Tim's voice was anxious on the other end. "Dad, Heather has a flat tire. We're at the arcade on D Street, and there are these guys hanging around her car. They look sketchy." Brian's stomach tightened as he listened. "Stay in the car, lock the doors, and call the police if there's any trouble," he instructed firmly. "I'll be there soon. Take care of the girls, okay?" He pocketed his phone and headed straight to the production floor. "Gus," he called out, spotting the man he needed. "You still drive that Corolla?" "Yeah," Gus replied, looking puzzled. "Perfect. I need your spare tire," Brian said, already leading Gus toward the parking lot. Minutes later, Brian and Gus arrived at the arcade, pulling up behind Heather's car. The group of hoodlums loitering nearby turned to watch them, their taunts starting almost immediately. Ignoring them, Brian quickly retrieved the jack and tire iron from Gus's trunk while Gus carried the spare tire. Brian knocked on Heather's window, signaling for her to lower it. "You three stay quiet and keep the doors locked," he instructed the girls calmly. "We'll get this fixed quickly. If these guys try anything, we'll handle it." The taunts from the bystanders grew louder as Brian and Gus got to work, but the two men paid them no attention. Brian unscrewed the lug nuts, removed the damaged tire, and accepted the replacement from Gus. Working efficiently, he secured the spare and tightened the bolts while Gus lowered the car. As Brian stood to his feet, his boot unintentionally connected with the leader of the group, catching the man in a sensitive spot. The young thug doubled over in pain, earning a sharp glare from Brian. "Are you idiots talking to us?" Brian said, his voice low but firm, his eyes steady. The group backed off without further incident, clearly reconsidering their bravado. Brian finished the job, ensured the girls were safe, and watched them drive off. Only then did he let himself relax, knowing he'd done what was necessary to protect his son and his friends. Back at work, Brenda had just started her day when Sue Blaine approached her at the water cooler, clearly eager to chat. Brenda could sense the woman had something on her mind, but she wasn't in the mood for small talk. Still, she braced herself, knowing Sue wouldn't leave until she had her say. Brenda had just begun processing the previous night's events when she overheard Sue Blaine talking at the water cooler. "I heard Brian, Jack Reynolds, and Gus Benson took care of some wannabe tough guys on D Street last night," Sue said, her voice animated. "Apparently, a few punks were hanging around some kid's car, and let's just say a tire iron does wonders for knocking the attitude out of them." Brenda felt a flicker of pride hearing Brian's actions described, but her emotions quickly shifted when Bill called her later that day. His tone was brisk, dismissive, and infuriating. "So, what's the problem?" Bill asked casually after Brenda explained what had happened. Brenda snapped. "The problem?" Brian acted like a real man, "Bill, while you turned your back on your own daughter. My son was in that car." Brenda's voice cracked with anger. Bill chuckled mockingly. "If your husband is such a saint, then why hasn't he touched you in months? You're here with me, aren't you? And don't forget, Brenda, I'm the one who helps relieve the pressure Brian puts on you. Don't flatter yourself, you pathetic," Brenda spat, her words dripping with contempt. "Brian is more of a man than you'll ever be." Bill's tone turned smug. "Really? Then why is your real man so uninterested in you? You turned to me because he couldn't be bothered. Face it, Brenda, if it weren't for me, you wouldn't even know what attention feels like." Brenda hung up, disgusted and fuming. But the confrontation stuck with her, gnawing at her guilt. She decided it was time to end things with Bill for good. Later that day, Brenda found herself face to face with Minx, who didn't mince words. "So, let me guess," Minx said dryly. "You told Bill it's over because you had no choice, right? After all, even traitors have to draw the line somewhere." Brenda's defenses went up immediately. "I never want to see Bill again," she said firmly. "I'm going to focus on my marriage. I'm staying here to show Brian what a great wife I can be." Minx arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Good luck with that. But let's not forget, Brian knows my loyalty is to him, while yours, well, your track record speaks for itself." Brenda's eyes flashed with indignation. "This is my marriage, Minx. You don't get to control it." Minx smirked. "Oh, but I do. As long as Brian and I are close, I won't let him near you. You can try all you want, but you'll find out soon enough, your round ass won't be enough to erase the damage you've done." Brenda's anger turned to determination. "I'm not giving up on my marriage. You might have his ear now, but I'll prove to Brian that I'm the only woman he needs." Minx leaned back, her tone dismissive. "We'll see, Brenda. But you'd better hope that when Brian makes his choice, you're ready for the answer."